Okay, ma'am, I guess I'll begin. We're also live on YouTube now. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fifth session of the second day of this international conference. The rapporteurs for this session are Zahra, Rizvi, and Jubi C. John. This is a plenary session, and I would invite Zahra and Jubi to kindly take over from here and introduce the chair for the session.
Thank you so much, Kashish. It gives me great joy to introduce the chair for this session, Professor Asaduddin. Author, critic, and translator in several languages, Professor Asaduddin writes on literature, language, politics, and translation studies. He is currently Dean, Faculty of Humanities and Languages, Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, and advisor to the Vice Chancellor. He was Fulbright Scholar in residence at Rutgers University, New Jersey, USA during 2008 to 2009. Earlier, he was a Charles Wallace Trust Fellow at the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia, Norwich, UK in 2000. He was a visiting professor in several Indian and foreign universities, including Jadavpur University, Calcutta, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, USA, University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, USA, and INALCO at Paris. Among his books are Complete Premchand Stories, Premchand in World Languages, Filming Fiction, Tagore, Premchand and Ray, A Life in Words, and the Penguin Book of Classic Urdu Stories. He has received a number of prizes, including Katha Award, Dr. A.K. Ramanujan Award, Sahitya Academy Award, and Crossword Book Award. He is also the chairperson of the Indian Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies. It is our delight to have you here, sir. I pass the mic to Professor Asaduddin so that he can introduce the plenary speakers for the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zahra, for your kind words. It is my pleasure, my absolute pleasure, to introduce the two speakers this afternoon. The first speaker is Margrit Pernau, and her paper this afternoon is Jazbat and Josh, the transformation of Urdu journalism around the First World War. A very interesting subject, and in our chat before the session formally began, I was wondering what Jazbat and Josh has to do with the development of language and standardization of language. Dr. Margrit Pernau holds a PhD in Indian history from Heidelberg University and a habilitation from Bielefeld University. Since 2008, she is senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute of Human Development, Center for the History of Emotions, Berlin. Her publications include Ashraf into Middle Classes, Muslims in 19th Century Delhi, Feeling Communities, Indian Economic and Social History Review, Spatial Issue, Monsoon Feelings, A History of Emotions in the Rain, and Emotions and Modernity in Colonial India, From Balance to Fervor. Welcome, Margrit. Our second speaker today is Arian Hopf, and he will be speaking on Urdu language ideologies and Pakistani identity. He is a lecturer for Urdu at South Asian Institute, Heidelberg. He has recently completed his PhD on the concept of religion in colonial South Asia with focus on the Aligarh movement. His PhD will soon be published as Translating Islam, Translating Religion. I'd first request Margrit to make her presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the organization of this lovely conference. I'm really enjoying it like anything, and I think it's the only conference for which I'm ready to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, not to miss any sessions. Historians of emotions have underlined the profound link that exists between emotions and language, and rightly so. Instead of assuming that emotions emerge fully formed in an interior space, they point out that language shapes emotions at three levels: at the level of expression, of knowledge, and of experience. Language is central to the expression of emotions. The investigation of emotion concepts and emotion metaphors provides us with indication how subjects conceive of emotions. that Jazbat became the central category for talking about emotions in Hindi and Urdu since the late 19th century indicates a specific understanding of emotions as a force which comes to the subject from the outside and draws him or her along. The language of emotions, in turn, feeds back to the possibilities how emotions are experienced. The question I propose to address in this paper is what happens to feelings once subjects move between languages. What specifically interests me in our context is the question what happens to emotions in a multilingual situation in which there is no functional division between languages. What effect does it have on emotions if the same topics can be and are talked about in different languages? Does this question our assumption of a strong link between emotions and language? So I think that is something that is familiar to most of us who are constantly switching between two or more languages. If language has this impact on emotions as we always thought, are we shifting emotions when we're shifting between languages? So do we have a plural universe, not only of languages, but also of emotions at our disposition in a situation of multilinguality? The case study I'm using to reflect upon these questions is one familiar to many of you. Muhammad Ali's twin newspapers, Comrade, founded in 1911, and Hamdard, joining 2 years later, are well known. For the time between April 1913, when Hamdard was founded, and November 1914, when Comrade was shut down by the colonial authorities, this allows us to compare first how the same events were depicted and interpreted in English and Urdu, and second, what kind of emotional registers were used in the two newspapers. Though Muhammad Ali stands at the center of attention, this is not an exercise in individual psychology. From Muhammad Ali's generation onward, an increasing number of the elite was bi or multilingual, and the two newspapers voiced not only the sentiments of the editor, but of a whole generation. Both Comrade and Hamdard took up the legacy of Aligarh and of Tehzib al-Akhlaq. Emotions had been central to this project because so much was at stake, but also because the reform of the community needed the transformative power of Josh, of intensely felt hot emotions, especially of the young man. So for Syed Ahmed Khan and his generation, you find text advocating strong emotions, which for some is a bit surprising because it does not correspond to our image of Syed Ahmed Khan, saying that only, especially the young man, have the power of Josh, is there still a hope for the community in the future. In the first decade of the 20th century, it looked as if Aligarh's loyalist politics had paid off. Things began to change with the revocation of the partition of Bengal in 1911, and change picked up speed in 1912 when the failed campaign to grant Aligarh College university status. The mobilization of the Muslims reached fever pitch in 1913 with the Balkan Wars and the destruction of a part of the Kanpur Mosque. These political developments were accompanied by new newspapers and journals. In 1911, Zafar Ali Khan's Zamindar, in 1912, Azad's Al-Hilal, and finally in 1913, Hamdard. Surprising for those whose knowledge about Muhammad Ali focuses on his later life, in which he was called a firebrand and a rebel rouser by the colonial authorities, the Muhammad Ali who founded the Comrade in 1911 was a declared loyalist in the tradition of the Simla Deputation and the early Muslim League. He saw the task of his newspaper in building bridges between the Muslims and the colonial government. Comrade was to be a speaker for the Muslim community. It addressed colonial officers, no less than Indians, and it catered to the tastes of both the audiences. Muhammad Ali believed that an understanding was possible if the Indian side curbed their passions and renounced excessive language and emotions, presenting themselves as reasonable interlocutors, and the British in turn entered into the spirit of this relationship and cured disaffection through affection. And I quote him, "The English have hitherto captivated our reason. I would have them ensnare our heart also. They command our respect. Let them also ask for a little of our love." End of quotation. At least for the moment, this strategy seems to have worked, and Muhammad Ali was satisfied with his position as a translator between the government and the community, a critical but esteemed and indispensable friend to both. What is even more surprising is the extent to which Muhammad Ali, in his English writings, adopts the colonial perspective on vernacular emotions, marked by their dangerous excess. Comparing the two newspapers, Muhammad Ali claimed, I quote, "The Hamdard was intended to educate the people, whereas the Comrade had to be their spokesman as well. I was anxious to exclude from the former all exciting topics, such as could not be avoided from the latter in the heat of advocacy. The readers of the Hamdard were not permitted to overhear what passed between the Comrade and the government in power in England." End of quotation. The same emotions, Muhammad Ali seemed to agree with the colonial government, which could be voiced without danger in English, became threatening if translated into the emotional language of Urdu. The article that introduces Comrade to its readers is a journalistic masterpiece. The political objective is clear. Comrade wants to bridge the gap between the races, the government and the rule, and between creeds, the Hindus and the Muslims. From the very first, this is as much a an emotional program as it is a political one. Though the author claims for himself, I quote, "sobriety of judgment and temperate expression." In the end, it were only emotions which could make the vision of a common future come true. I quote, "Remove pride and suspicion on one side and prejudice and suspicion on the other, and it will not be difficult to throw a cantilever bridge across the yawning chasm." End of quotation. For Sir Syed, the future had been a trope of anxiety. Future generations who had been denied a life in honor and prosperity, crying out to the present to fight for them in the rapidly closing window of opportunity. Muhammad Ali's emotions for the future were no less intense. However, unlike Sir Syed, they were driven by an almost chiastic hope for days when the ruler and the ruled would become one, linked by a bond of mystical love which bridged all differences. His confidence in his ability to play a crucial, if not the crucial role in this history was unbounded in these early days of the Comrade. There was Josh in his striving for balance and drunkenness in his pursuit of sobriety. The tone of the introductory article to Hamdard is very different. This is not only a difference in language. The bright hopes of the beginning of 1911, by mid-1913, had gone through severe disappointments. In June 1st, the article Bismillah announced the official birth of the newspaper Hamdard and set out his programs. Muhammad Ali uses the traditional tropes of modesty, playing down his efforts and foregrounding his anxiety that Hamdard will not have an honorable existence. All the passionate longing for Hamdard, which the future readers had expressed, did nothing but increase the anxious responsibility of the editor. The foregrounding of these anxieties and the support he claims to need from his readers sound quite different from the self-confident civilizing mission of the Urdu reading community that he had promised to take up, writing in English. In Urdu, he writes, "The night falls and we are walking in darkness. If we get lost, we will never reach our goal. Readers can become our guides, and when we go astray, they can stop us." So already the program, the way of talking about English and talking about Urdu is very different in the two languages, and he uses quite a different emotional register. The first 18 months of Comrade were marked by the proclamation of a calm certitude with regard to the future. Though Muhammad Ali admitted his love for what he called the impatient idealist, he also feared him and did not trust him. Evolution required steady progress. The time of the Muslims would come if they steadfastly held on to hope and continued their work. In this, they could trust the help and benevolence of the colonial power. This future was awaited with some excitement, but mainly with a willingness to proceed patiently, one step at a time. The pace might be slow, much work and some sacrifices would be needed, but the march of time would be steady and the future would be good. Overall, the mood was one of profound hope and confidence. It was the British policy in the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 13, its support for the Ottoman provinces fighting for independence, and the rhetoric the British used of a crusade against Islam that went with it, which completely shattered his hopes for the future. Muhammad Ali's feelings of devastation were so profound that he even contemplated suicide. His interpretation of the world, of the place of the present in history and time, and of his own role in bringing about the future unity between creeds and races, all lay in shards. Again, this was not an individual psychological moment, at least not only, but the experience of a whole generation. Over the next month, his articles in Comrade repeatedly bemoaned the Muslims' lost, I quote, childlike trust in the goodwill of Europe, end of quotation. If there were to be any future for the Muslims in India and the world, they would have to rely on their own strength. Hamdard only entered the fray once the Balkan Wars were over, making a direct comparison difficult, as we cannot tell for sure which of the changes were due to language and which to the change in time. In Comrade, Muhammad Ali was both vocal and emotional with reference to Islam, but what he emphasized was not so much its religious aspect, which disappeared behind a vague spiritual idea of unity, as is social ethics. The tone in Hamdard was notably different. Din and dunya, religion and the world, could not be separated. Any deterioration of the worldly positions of the Muslims also involved a religious decline and vice versa. The reform of the Muslim community accordingly could not be limited to changing their material circumstances and providing them with new enthusiasm, but meant a return to observing the 5 pillars of Islam. Working for the advancement of the Muslims was required, but it was no substitute for ibadat. After the Balkan Wars and the campaign for turning the Aligarh College into a full-fledged university, the events around the mosque in Kanpur in 1913 were the third event in a short time which shook the Indian Muslim community. Together, they resulted in a profound transformation. The facts of Kanpur are well known, and I don't need to repeat them here. In spite of his bitter disappointment at the British after the Balkan War, Muhammad Ali once again tried to take up the position of a mediator behind the scenes. While the matter of the destruction of the washing house of the Kanpur Mosque was still under consideration, neither Comrade nor Hamdard reported anything on the events at Kanpur, once again trying to prove their sobriety and their trustworthiness and avoiding to excite the josh of the Islamic public. Once again, Muhammad Ali was disappointed. It was clear that the program of unity between ruled and ruler brought about by the good offices of a young Muslim journalist was much less attractive to the authorities than he had thought, and he could not prevent the planned destruction. Comrade limited itself to describing the outraged feeling of the community. Its criticism was described in a sarcastic voice, mocking the authorities. As a leader of the Muslims, he exhorted them to stop crying, I quote, Let us request them, for God's sake, not to play the woman. A great blow has been dealt to their religious feeling, but they are expected to bear themselves manfully. Let them prove for once that they can act with courage, determination, sustained energy in time of need. End of quotation. The expression of emotions and the feeling rules here draw more from the colonial discourse than from Urdu. Muhammad Ali was willing to fight for the Muslim community. He was indignant at their behalf, but he kept his emotional distance, at least in English. This distance started to fade once the report from the police violence came in. A tragedy, I quote, that is being mourned in every Muslim home throughout India. End of quotation. Here the reports, I quote, on children mangled to death and crying in agony, venerable old men hunted out of their place of hiding in the mosque and gored with spears, end of quotation, acquire an immediacy that was lacking earlier and is thus closing the gap between the English and the Urdu reporting to some extent at least. Hamdard, from the first, had used emotional and religious language to report and interpret the events at Kanpur. Where Comrade consistently spoke of the sacrilege of Kanpur, Hamdard called it a shahadat, took up the invocation of Karbala, which ran through most of the sermons, speeches, and articles in the Urdu public sphere. Already at the first article, Hamdard gave rise to the pain of the subjects and placed their hearts at the center of the discourse. It gave voice to the religious leaders. It reported Al-Hilal's indictment of the dishonoring of the mosque, the resulting Josh among the Muslims, and the reopening of the question whether under these circumstances India might still be considered a Dar-ul Aman. Its printing of the telegram that Khaja Hassan Nizami had addressed to the Viceroy laid the seeds of an alliance which was further developed by the appointment of Nizami as Comrade's and Hamdard's special correspondent in Kanpur. Once the violence had taken place, the emotions come close in their level of intensity, but Hamdard foregrounds the vocabulary of insulted honor implicit in the colonial denial of the authenticity of their Josh, and once again brings religious sentiments more directly into play, though they are by no means absent in Comrade as well. The talk has I come to my conclusion. The talk has shown that the movement towards Josh and Jazbat continued to gain in intensity in the years before the First World War and became the dominant mood for the Urdu public sphere immediately before the war. What we have seen for Hamdard seems also to have been true for Zamindar and for Al-Hilal. Urdu can be classified as a vernacular language giving voice to vernacular emotions. But if vernacularization refers to a process, to a movement from one language to another, things become more complicated. Was there a movement from English to Urdu? Urdu taking over the expression of emotions hitherto common in English? Hardly. We don't see Hamdard adopting to the emotional style of Comrade, rather the tendency went the other way round. So does it make sense to talk of the vernacularization of English in the Indian context? Finally, we have to reflect that the coming together of the emotional style in English and Urdu, with Urdu taking the lead, as we have seen, what that means for the vernacularization of politics. The joining of forces of the Aligarh and Deoband movements of the Western educated and the ulama is usually seen as the hallmark of the Khilafat movement. Here we can show that this not only happened earlier, Muhammad Ali's reconversion in jail was a result rather than a precondition of this movement, but also that this joining of forces went much deeper than the strategic alliance that many have taken it to be. Since 1913, they increasingly shared not only their political goals, but also emotional styles anchored in Urdu and partly translated into English. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Margrit, for a very stimulating paper. The question is, do languages in themselves inscribe certain kind of emotions? Implicit in the language, is there a history of emotion? Do we associate particular emotions with particular languages? Professor Margrit tried to bring out the different tenors of language that were used for comrade and hamdard. In hamdard, it is emotional, it is jazbat, it is josh. In English, it is restrained. And from there, the discussion proceeds further. Do we look at, or the kind of audience these two newspapers are addressing? Because in the same time frame, we find that Premchand was writing bilingually. And when he was writing in Urdu, he was using one kind of register. When he was writing in Hindi, he was using a different kind of register. This is one thought. Please park that thought. It might come up in the question hour. The second is, each language has also a rhetorical tradition, which is there historically. We understand that in India, if we have 24 languages now, standard languages which are institutionalized, and Sahitya Academy awards gives awards in those languages, each one of them has its own rhetorical tradition, and sometimes we compare between them. We make assumptions as well. We have easy assumptions that Urdu is the language of love, Bengali is a sweet language, some language is something else. How proper is that? The paper gives us adequate opportunity to think about these aspects, and I'm sure she will take them into consideration during the question hour. With that, I would request Arian Hopf to make his presentation.
Shall we take questions now?
Absolutely. This is.
Yeah. So rapporteurs can read out the questions and Margrit can respond to them.
I'll read out the questions for you. The first question is from Professor Nishad Saidi. English is generally linked to balanced emotions, whereas vernaculars have been associated with emotional fervor and excesses. Did any of these aspects of language influence the early reformers? Did they apply English balance over their vernacular fervor, or vice versa, or both? I'll take two more questions and then we can move on to the rest. The second question is, how was Muhammad Ali able to maintain a balance between translating emotions and at the same time laying a strong emphasis in the true newspapers? We have another question by Professor Hans Harder. Does the binary of language of expression versus language of reflection, see for reference to Gupta Kaviraj lecture yesterday, work on Muhammad Ali's linguistic division of labor?
Okay. I think one of the dangers of even posing the question of the influence of languages on emotion is that if we are not really careful, it might lead to an essentialization of emotions and of languages. And that is, of course, the last thing I would like to do as a historian of emotions. So usually my mantra is always to point out how much emotions are diverse, how much they are changing through time, through the different audiences. So I think this is the kind of baseline that we have to keep in mind. So there is not one set of emotions which applies to either English or Urdu, and saying Urdu is an emotional language does not make sense. It really would sideline so many traditions which are there in Urdu as well, and which are there in English as well, that it would really impoverish our research. On the other hand, I think it is really true that we need rhetorical traditions in order to be able to develop stable emotions. So there might be something like a vague basic feeling somewhere in the back of our mind, but to transform that into an emotion that we are aware of, we need language. And my question, which I would like to discuss with you, because I really haven't reached a conclusion on that as yet, is what does this language do to the emotions? So we're always assuming that the language we are using to reflect on our own emotions, the language we are used to talk about emotions, to have a knowledge about emotions, to expect certain emotions in certain situations, that has a profound impact on emotions. So emotions are never only expressive, but they also create the feelings that we have. So it's always a two-way process. And what I'm trying to do through this figure of Muhammad Ali, because he has talked so much on the way that he is using language and throughout his life. So we really have these statements about what he wants to do with English, what is the role of the audience, what he can do with Urdu, what the Urdu audience expects from him, how he needs to adapt his language to that. That I think it might be worthwhile pushing that to see what does it do to his emotions. So is he two different emotional? Do we have two editors writing one editor writing in two different languages and having two different sets of emotions? I think that might be what originally he envisaged. So originally he thought from an English perspective and saying, okay, let me teach the natives. So this identification you have with the English language and taking up a knowledge of emotion, which he then applied to Urdu. But the interesting thing is that breaks down very quickly. So basically it breaks down with the first article that he publishes in Hamdard, because he can't say that in Urdu. So he can't take up the civilizational role, and he really, and I would really like to read that first Bismillah text with someone of you, because there are so many nuances that I'm not sure that my Urdu is good enough really to catch them. So it is adopting an Oriental stance, and at the same time, it is like having an irony. So being aware that he is playing the Oriental, but at the same time becoming what he is dressing up. So I imagine it that in the beginning of even writing the article, he says, okay, let's be the Oriental because that is what my audience requires from me. And then once he gets into the language, he is caught in the language, and the irony seems to disappear. But that is something that really would require a sentence by sentence analysis of that article. I think there is much to be done with that. So if I find someone who would be willing to go through the article with me, I would love that.
Thank
so
you.
I think that covered more or less the different questions so far.
Yes,
Maybe we can move on to the next speaker.
Yeah, sure.
Professor Asaduddin, if you could.
Okay, I have to take over.
Yes.
Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Arian Hopf, and if you have forgotten, his paper is Urdu Language Ideologies and Pakistani Identity.
Yeah, thank you very much for this introduction. I hope you all can hear me well. Yeah, okay. Yeah, and thank you also very much for the opportunity to present my paper here in this conference. And in the meantime, I try to share my presentation, my screen for the presentation. I hope you can see it now. Yeah. So what I try to do in this paper is to present different counter narratives to the master narrative of Islam as the basis for Pakistani identity. I try to define three strands of how Pakistan was perceived in the first decades after its formation. The three strands I could identify are based first, of course, on Islam, then second on the geography of the present territory of Pakistan, and lastly on Urdu and in particular the Indo-Muslim culture. And the latter strand is what I will discuss here in the following paper. Pakistan struggled for an autonomous identity right from its beginning. The question of what unites this country was posed right after 1947 and seems to remain unanswered till date. Without doubt, Islam served as a central aspect for defining Pakistani identity, but soon after partition, Muslim unity lost its appeal and ethnic or linguistic bonds were increasingly emphasized. Another essential part of the identity of Pakistan hinges on its distinction from India, a country which now inherited most of the geographical places connected to Muslim history on the subcontinent. Yet Urdu was declared Pakistan's national language, a language that had no dissemination as first language in the territory of Pakistan, but was originally spread in areas now part of the Indian territory. Thus, Pakistan could not eliminate its historical and linguistic link to India. By the time shortly before and after the creation of Pakistan, the Islamic narrative was by no means the only or even most prevalent idea of how Pakistan would be. In fact, liberal and secular forces were in the leading position, and on the example of Muhammad Hassan Askari, I will provide a counter-narrative imagining Pakistan as heaven for Urdu literature. Askari was a writer of short stories and perhaps the most eminent literary critic of Urdu in the 20th century. He was by no means a staunch supporter of the creation of Pakistan right from the outset, but since 1946 he begins to discuss this topic positively, yet still discerningly. In a column from 1946, Askari discusses his support for the case of the Muslim League, yet also expresses his restrictions and conditions. For he perceived Pakistan as a dream where Urdu literature would receive its rightful position in defining Pakistani culture. But he would not tolerate any strictures or limitations on literature and artistic freedom in Pakistan. Under these circumstances, Pakistan would prove to be a blessing for literati, for Muslims would no more be compelled to play the role of a minority as in undivided India. This would breathe new life into Urdu literature as its writers would gain a political significance so far unknown to them. Critique of the government would have an impact as it could no more be played down as the voice of a minority. Askari bases his idea of Pakistan on the idea of the Indo-Muslim culture, thus arguing that, I quote, Pakistan is basically old, unquote, and not a country only recently founded. Thus, he intervenes in a debate about the Muslim reformer Amir Ali and whether he can be described as Pakistani. Since he had passed away already in 1928, the debate in the first instance appears to be obscure. Yet it reflects also a prevalent idea of Pakistan, not as a geographically defined country, but rather culturally or by religion. The former definition seems to be what Askari had in mind when he ironically, but also anxiously asks whether then also the two eminent poets of Urdu literature, Mir and Ghalib, have to be excluded from the Pakistani heritage. According to Askari, Pakistan was not claimed only for those Muslims of its present territory, but for all Muslims of the south of the Indian subcontinent. In the same context, he also expresses his anxiety about an Islamization of Pakistan, but equally about the exclusion of Urdu from the realm of Pakistani heritage, as it is a foreign language originally not spread in the territory of Pakistan. Instead of an idea of Pakistan based either on religion or on geographical restrictions, Askari advocated a different conception of Pakistan based on the Indo-Muslim culture, with Urdu being its identity marker. He makes clear that one must not confuse this as a simplistic equation with Islam, as he also underscores the contribution of non-Muslims in this culture and language. One has to distinguish between Islam and Muslims, or else Islam must not be restricted to its notion of a metaphysical philosophy, but has to be seen as a cultural force, as he terms it. Herewith, Asghari presents a narrative for Pakistan which is based on an anti-territorial identity, with its center being based outside the current territory, as Urdu was linked rather to present India. Asghari tries to consolidate this identity of Pakistan on the entirety of a Muslim claim for the creation of a separate country, while the Muslim culture of the subcontinent is, according to Asghari, epitomized in Urdu. Herewith, he draws on the ideologically created link between Urdu and Islam, while he, however, has a broader notion of Islam as culture in mind. But he was unable to see the upcoming conflict between the Muhajirs, the Urdu-speaking immigrants from present India, and the locals of Pakistan with their distinct languages and literary traditions, and rather fostered it with a narrative of a superiority of the former. For the essence of Muslim culture was reflected in the Muhajirs' language, which is Urdu. In Asghari, we see an alternative and influential narrative of Pakistan, which explicitly was not based on Islam as a religion, but on a distinct culture of South Asian Muslims. Yet Asghari's linking of this culture only with Urdu gave birth to critique by proponents of the regional languages. Some years later, when Jamil Jalebi, a prominent linguist and scholar of Urdu literary history, engaged in the still pending quest for a national identity, culture, and wrote his Pakistani culture in 1964, he had already realized some of the discussed shortcomings in Asghari's claim. Jalebi recognizes inner conflicts in Pakistan after its foundation based on the fact that, I quote, "From the cultural point of view, Pakistan came into being in a vacuum," unquote. Instead of referring to an own cultural stock, Jalebi perceives a search for cultural identity in the West, a process he strongly condemns. In a similar vein as Asghari, Jalebi too refers to the Indo-Muslim culture without which Pakistan would be meaningless. For, quote, "Without a past, no people can become a nation and no land a country," unquote. Again, Jalebi too recognizes Urdu as epitome or product of this culture. And I quote here, "It is Indo-Muslim culture which is the source of our solidarity, our spiritual unity, and our conception of ourselves as a nation. Of it has been born the Urdu language, and our music, our building, our architecture, painting, and calligraphy are expressions of its spirit." Yet, he also recognizes geographical limitations implied in the partition, with crucial historical places now being located in India. But as part of the Indo-Muslim culture, Jalebi does not exclude them for merely geographical reasons. Apart from this geographical separation, he also acknowledges the regional cultures and languages of the Pakistani territory, but questions their ability to form a national identity. Only Urdu can bridge Pakistan's inner contradictions as a lingua franca known by all. Hence, Jalebi recognizes two crucial difficulties in the search for a Pakistani culture. First, the regional aspirations, which in his opinion cannot serve as a national identity, while on the other hand, the reference to the Indo-Muslim culture, perceived to be common to all South Asian Muslims, is to a large extent separated from the current territory of Pakistan and located in India. In his Pakistani culture, Jalebi does not further substantiate his preference of Urdu over the regional languages and cultures, aside from its character as a lingua franca. He does not further elaborate on how to bridge the geographical detachment of the Indo-Muslim history, as well as its language, Urdu, being located in northern India. Yet a reading of his voluminous History of the Urdu Literature, Tarikh-e-Adab Urdu, written in 1977, reveals some intriguing insights into his understanding of Urdu, its relation to the other languages of Pakistan, as well as its origin. In his history of the Urdu literature, Jalabi in the first instance seems to argue that Urdu has originated from Punjabi. Referring to older proponents of this claim, like, for example, Hafiz Mahmud Khan Shirani's Punjab mein Urdu, Jalabi bases this assertion on old texts of Dakkani, a variety of Urdu that came to be used for literary writings in the Deccan region since the 15th century and long before Urdu came in vogue in northern India as a literary language. Apart from lexical peculiarities, as a comparatively less advanced Persianization and influences from southern languages like Marathi and Telugu, this variety is also characterized by some grammatical features which Jalabi ascribes to Punjabi. With reference to Multan as the first capital of a Muslim reign in South Asia, Jalabi sees the Punjab as the place of the origin of Urdu. And I quote again, "In the period of the origin of Urdu, the people of Punjab and Multan had a great influence on the politics and society of the subcontinent. Therefore, the accent, melody, and tone of Punjabi was contained in the blood of this language, which is Urdu, right from the beginning." Without discussing the linguistic intricacies of this claim, one can see here Jalabi's attempt to geographically relocate Urdu in the current territory of Pakistan. In this vein, Urdu can fulfill its role as epitome of the Indo-Muslim culture without its geographical location being confined to current Indian territory. In fact, Urdu is rather presented something inherently Pakistani, as this is its actual origin. And another quote, "Now after 1200 years, Urdu has returned to its land of origin, thus closing the circle that was started right after Muhammad bin Qasim's conquest of Sindh in 712. Yet Jalabi does not finish with this claim. Since Punjab was always perceived as the best developed and most powerful province of Pakistan, this is perhaps the reason why Jalabi does not want to link Urdu only to Punjab, but emphasizes the encompassing claim for the origin of Urdu in all languages of Pakistan. And I quote again, "One of its forms emerged in Sindh and Multan. Afterwards, this linguistic process happened in Punjab and the border region to Afghanistan, from where it arrived circa 2 centuries later in Delhi. Here it mingled and was mingled with the present languages and spread over the entire subcontinent. This relation with various languages, as well as the claim of various regions on the origin of this language, proves that it, that is Urdu, has profited from all these languages and created its own unique character. Therefore, this language is the language of all subcontinental languages and is now as then the lingua franca of the entire subcontinent." Jalabi relates the 4 main regional languages of Pakistan, Pashto, Balochi, Sindhi, and Punjabi, with Urdu. While he can do this more or less convincingly for Sindhi and Punjabi, he faces some difficulties with Pashto and Balochi being related to another linguistic family. In the case of Pashto, Jalabi relates Hindko, a close relative of Punjabi, with this process, while he does not present any detailed discussion on behalf of Balochi. While Sindhi, Punjabi, and Hindko could be related linguistically, he relates Pashto first and foremost as a contact language, increasing the lexicon of Urdu. In the same vein, Jalabi seems to argue for a shared Indo-Muslim lexicon, common to quite some extent to all these 4 languages, a fact which he bases on a shared vocabulary to express the basic tenets of Islam. Furthermore, all these languages and their shared lexicon are an expression of the Islamic spirit. And I quote again, "What is common to all languages of West Pakistan is Urdu and its lexicon, wherein the Islamic spirit has been implanted of this sort that Islam and Urdu have become each other's representative and symbol." Jalebi does not only relocate Urdu to the territory of Islam, but furthermore describes it as a representative and symbol of Islam, as well as a conglomerate of all languages of Pakistan. Urdu comes to be the glue between the different languages, as it is a product of blending. Hence, Jalebi deliberately does not concludingly decide between the different claims on Urdu, but rather lets them coexist as an expression of the shared participation on its origin. This way, Urdu is not only a Pakistani language, but the Pakistani language, which has profited from all other regional languages. Though Urdu is not described as superior to the other languages, it still receives a prominent position among equals. Jalebi seems to broaden the notion of lingua franca being not only a language known to all as a medium of communication, but being also the outcome of a collective development. On this basis, Jalebi can bypass the location of Urdu as a foreign language to Pakistan on the one hand and aspirations of regional languages on the other. In his line of argument, Urdu is the only language that can claim to be a Pakistani language, applying to all citizens on the national level. And herewith I come to the conclusion: is Islam the only identity category that unites Pakistan? Even though the significance of Islam as crucial aspect of Pakistani identity cannot be denied, this paper aimed to broaden the notion of Islam as it was perceived in the imagination of Pakistan. In the strand focusing on the Indo-Muslim culture as identity of Pakistan, we find a centralist narrative strongly favoring Urdu with, however, different arguments. In Muhammad Hasan Askari, we saw a strong proponent of Urdu as epitome of this culture. Hence, he imagined Pakistan as heaven for Urdu literature, neglecting or rather overlooking regional languages of Pakistan with equal ambitions. Askari also strongly advocates for the Islamic identity of Pakistan, but only as a social category of solidarity. Neither does Askari conceive of Islam as religion or metaphysical philosophy, as he terms it, but rather as a culture that is based on the fundamental tenets of Islam. While his narrative entirely overlooked the regional languages and cultures, Jamil Jalebi included all the various opposing strands and aimed to present an all-encompassing narrative, bringing together these opposing forces. He again discusses the origin of Urdu and aims at geographically relocating it in the territory of Pakistan, thus refuting descriptions of Urdu as a foreign language. Not only that in his narrative, Urdu returns in Pakistan to its land of origin, Jalebi is also cautious to allow all regional languages of Pakistan a share on its development. Thus, Urdu cannot be claimed by a single region. What is more, Urdu seems to be construed as a shared language between all these languages, not only pertaining the acquaintance with it, but also with regard to its origin. Urdu does not merely remain a symbol of the Indo-Muslim culture, but is rather a product of the same. As could be observed in the preceding discussion, a confinement of Pakistani identity solely to Islam is not warranted. Even though Islam is undeniably a crucial category, one at least has to broaden its notion, since limiting it to a merely social category is not justifiable for the various narratives of Pakistan. The equation of Urdu and Islam in the aftermath of the Hindi-Urdu controversy has rather created other narratives which still refer to Islam, but only through a linguistic and or cultural backdoor of Urdu and the Indo-Muslim culture. The two presented examples of Askari and Jalebi reverse this equation of Islam and Urdu in emphasizing an Indo-Muslim culture that is not confined by religious confession. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hopf. Yeah, I'm just wondering if our chair wants to say a few words and then I can read the questions.
Yeah. Are you still seeing my screen, or has it disappeared now? Because I'm a bit struggling with that.
We can still see it.
Okay. Then I don't really know how to stop.
It would just show a stop sharing option on the Zoom screen.
I think now it should have disappeared. Is it?
No, it's
no.
still here.
Yeah.
We'll just.
Professor Asaduddin can give his remarks in the meanwhile.
Right.
Yeah, now.
Okay, as I was saying, the paper tries to articulate two of the factors as he calls it categories that were instrumental in the creation and then imagining of Pakistan. One is religion and the other is the language, Urdu. If I remember correctly, after the creation of Pakistan, this question of the history of Pakistan, where does it begin? Does it begin with 1947, the history of Pakistani Urdu literature? Does it begin at 1947? These questions were threshed out, discussed in a sustained manner by Intizar Hussain and Qasmi Saab in their long conversations and dialogues. And in the arguments that are put forward in the context of Askari and Jamil Jalabi, one finds different shades of that argument. What would perhaps surprise one is that in the formulation and cogitations of all these thinkers, the eastern wing of Pakistan perhaps either does not figure or has a very marginal position, though population-wise, it was the greater half. So with these opening comments, I'll leave the questions and comments to the floor.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm going to be reading out a few questions from the chat box. If it's okay with Dr. Hopf, I can probably just take 3 questions together and then you can respond, all right? So the first question is from Kashish, and she has asked, Askari's idea of Islam as cultural reminds me of Intizar Hussein's notion of a syncretic Islam. Do you see a similarity even in their understandings of Urdu as a language and its potential? The second question is from Professor Zaidi, who has asked, Urdu was cleansed of its Hindi influence in Pakistan, something Intizar Hussain so strongly resented. How does that reflect the failure of Urdu to link itself to people who were as much a multicultural, multilingual lot as people in India? And finally, the third question for you is from Torsten Sasser, who says, how do Askari and Jalebi engage with the separation of Bangladesh and consequently Bengali Muslim cultures? On to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for these interesting questions. And I would also agree with these comments or questions that, of course, there are quite some commonalities and similarities between Askari and Intizar Hussain that present or focus on this shared common Indo-Muslim culture. And I guess they were also, or I think they were also in context and talking about these ideas. So I think it wouldn't be I think it might well be that these ideas are quite common because of their context. And to the third question, that's actually an interesting point about Bengali, because in the well, I think in the context of Muhammad Hassan Askari, I presented this already, that he doesn't really care about the regional languages. He doesn't care about the languages of West Pakistan, and he doesn't talk about East Pakistan at that time at all, as far from what I have read. The picture is a bit different in Jamil Jalebi. Well, not in his later publication, because his history was published in 1977. So there the discussion was in a way obsolete. But in his earlier publication, this Pakistani Culture from 1964, he still talks about this problem. And he sees that, of course, the regional languages have equal ambitions for their focus on the various traditions, literary traditions, cultures, etc. And of course, he's also talking about Bengali. So he's aware of that. And his solution to that was a two-language formula, which would allow people to learn, on the one hand, one regional language, and on the other hand, Urdu as as a broader language. Interestingly, he doesn't talk about English, because he seems to try to exclude English from this field and rather focus on Urdu as the lingua franca working for all spheres of Pakistan.
Thank you so much for your responses, Dr. Hopf. I would love to take the other questions in the chat box, but unfortunately, we seem to be running out of time. So people who are still interested in looking for answers can maybe email you at a later point of time. Thank you so much to our lovely speakers today, Dr. Pernau and Dr. Hopf. We've had a great time with both of you. And as you can see from the chat box, we aren't going to let go of this session anytime soon. And thank you so much for our wonderful, wonderful chair, Professor Asaduddin. We couldn't have done any of this without you. So yes, I think Professor Asaduddin wants to say something, and Kashish can take over after that.
Just I complimented you by showing my thumb.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much. Yes, Kashish.
Thank you, Zahra. Thank you, Jubi. We'll just be starting with our next session, which is a paper presentation session.